And we're back, and we're moving into our first conversation for this morning. As we all get excited about the extended weekend ahead, it is a first-time celebration for Belize as we commemorate Emancipation Day. And it's a much bigger deal than just having a 3-day weekend. It is a very historically significant day. And here to teach us all about the history of it, we have the history lecturer from St. John's College, Delmer Zib. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
How are you today, Delmer?
I'm doing extremely well. It's all about how you see the day. If you see it good, it will go good.
That's right.
Awesome.
Now, Delmer, I know we've all been talking about having an extended weekend, but we shouldn't miss the opportunity to be able to learn as much as we can about Emancipation Day itself. And this ties right back to our history and our connection with slavery in this region. So Delmer, let's just dive right into this. Let's talk about the fact that Belize did not celebrate Emancipation Day while most of the other countries in the region did.
Well, actually, that's one of the things that I wanted to start off with, that this is very emotional, actually, for me, especially as a history lecturer, as a history teacher. I've been teaching about this topic for many years. We've been talking about it for many years as well. And it's emotional to now have it as a national celebration because there was a celebration. So I have participated. I've not been in the organizing committee, but the UEF, along with the IA Marine Coleman, have been very steady in terms of organizing a commemoration almost every year. It is very emotional now because now that the government has supported the idea of celebrating emancipation, there's a lot more attention given to the topic of emancipation itself. Yeah. And it is very heartwarming to see the series of events that are going to happen, the educational tools that are coming out of the production of the celebration of Emancipation Day as well. And first of all, I want to say very clearly, one of the things about celebrating Emancipation Day is why until today?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the first questions that comes into my mind. I mean, emancipation occurred in 1838, so we're talking about over 100 years. Why is it that until today we're deciding to celebrate this? I wanted to go further and actually put some pointers out there.
Yes.
Where one of the discussions that we need to have is what really changed after emancipation. Emancipation was a social and a political probably transition that was happening. But on the ground, there were other things that were being placed by the masters. So yes, there was a transition. Yes, there was freedom. But then you also need to understand that there was economic things happening behind the scenes, aspects as it relates to access to land, labor contracts, cultural things such as the advance and truck system. All of those things were also put in place to sort of keep these persons or the former slaves tied to their ex-masters. So yes, we're celebrating freedom, but we need to have a serious discussion and a critical discussion that is as to how is it that the transition occurred from being an enslaved person to post 1838.
Can we dive just a bit deeper there? Because I think a part of the history that we've not connected and we don't talk about very often is the history of slavery in Belize. Yeah. And there was an exhibit a few years back, definitely within the past 10 years, where we started to kind of chip away at opening that discussion. But it's not something we openly discuss.
Yes, that's very true, actually. One of the things that we've been fighting with is this narrative that, everything, it's almost like, in Belize, everything, the history of Belize, everything was so cool, everything was dandy.
Yeah.
Everybody was living in peace and there was, it's almost like a nostalgic feel to it then.
Yeah.
We also need to understand who were the storytellers and what was their purpose. So there's a purpose in writing history, there's a purpose in teaching history, and there's a purpose, of course, in sharing a particular ideology. For a number of times, I think that the history of slavery, as it relates to Belizean history, have also been undermined. And some people would even say, slavery was better in Belize than in the rest of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
They were treated better in Belize anyway. But to me, it's an issue of human dignity, and it's an issue of agency. When you are put, a slave basically denotes that you're a property. You have no say. You have no agency. Slavery is slavery, whichever way you take it. You're being forced to do things that you do not want. You're being overworked. You're being abused, and obviously that's something that we need to clash with to an extent. We need to learn all of this because it shows the reality of slavery in Belize. And to an extent, I believe that the null or the non-celebration of Emancipation was an effort as well to try to, push under the rug all of this history of slavery.
Delmer, I wonder how many Belizeans, if they should look back, would actually find that they have some sort of slave history in their lineage.
No, I mean, yes, and that's actually a topic that is, again, touchy. You understand? Some people are not too comfortable with discussing that sort of reality, where either you're a descendant or either your ancestors were masters. And it's something that we need to, realize and basically deal with. It's a process of reconciliation, a process of, to an extent, reparation of the soul as well. But as I said, to me, this whole issue is an issue of human dignity and human rights, where we cannot hide the reality that the slave trade was human trafficking. You understand? It was human trafficking.
And where do we even begin with dealing with these sensitive matters?
Well, to me, it all starts with having a rootedness. In other words, we're trying to discover that sense of being, with that sense of identity. It is important for us as Belizeans to understand where we come from, to understand what connections we have. And I am talking about even myself. I am of my heritage, but I believe that I have a connection to Africa as well.
Yeah.
To understand that and also mitigate all of those stages of history with the lens of trying to say, how do we deal with these different traumas that our people have been going through in order to create this Belize that we're living in today?
So let's go back to some of the work that the slaves were brought to Belize, then British Honduras, to be able to do. Let's try to trace it back a bit and build connections.
Okay, so one of the things that we need to understand is that the early records show that by 1724, some of the enslaved population was already, or there was a number of enslaved people in British Honduras already. But if you want to find the origins of this, let's go back a bit to the Spanish before we get into the British. When the Spanish Empire basically clashed with America, their initial aim was to get a labor force from the native people of the Americas. In fact, Christopher Columbus was saying, enslave the Taínos. But the Queen was against that. And then you have a priest coming along, Bartolomeo de las Casas. And the priest said, you know what? He wanted to protect the natives of America. He said, you know what? Why don't we go to Africa? They have people over there. Let's bring them across and use them as a labor force. Unfortunately for him and for his legacy, that particular suggestion also pushed this whole idea of going to Africa to get free people, convert them into captives, and bring them into America. In the Caribbean, the enslaved population were used primarily in the sugar plantations. As it relates to British Honduras, they were primarily used in the extraction of logwood and mahogany. In fact, the amount of enslaved people that you had was also a condition for the amount of, or the size of your mahogany camp per se, or the camp where you're going to extract. The enslaved population were brought in, and it was a very inhumane practice. Records show that the Europeans, you had the Dutch had the Dutch West India Company, the British also had the Royal Caribbean, the Royal Adventurers Company, where they would go into Africa and negotiate. Some of them would negotiate with African kings in Africa, or some of them would go directly and raid as well. This would happen in the latter part of the slave trade. But they would do night raids within the chaos, capture people, take them to the port cities, and then take them to the port areas where they would sell them to these companies, put them in barracoons, ship them in a phase that is called the Middle Passage, which is the most inhumane passage, where they would basically, like sardines, be put on
Yes.
boats and sent off into America. Many of them died in that process. Many of the captives died in that process. And when they would reach the Caribbean, and they would either be sold in actions. So you could imagine you're an object, you're being actioned to the highest bidder.
Yeah.
And then there was also another process or another way of selling people, which was through the scramble method. So they would put 4 or 5 people and put a price to them. And then the masters in the Caribbean would just jump into the ship and try to assess if the cost was right, and then pay for a set of captives.
Yeah.
All of this was dehumanizing, of course. So many of the African of the captives that were brought into British Honduras were taken or were bought in Jamaica. Once they came here, some of them were working in towns, while the others were going into camps to go and extract logwood and mahogany. So you had there were different occupations at camp. You had the huntsmen. The duty of the huntsman was basically to search for the locations that had the trees. You had the axemen, which would be to, of course, chop down the tree. And then you also had the cattlemen, which would be the one dragging the logs to the riversides or to the riverbanks when they would be sent down the river. And then, of course, you also had a group of people that were dealing with food production.
Yeah. Well,
So
where does the narrative come from that the slaves in Belize live differently or live better than those in the rest of the Caribbean? Is it based on the type of work that they were doing?
It was based on the type of work that they were doing, primarily because you had a supervisor, which is presumed a white man out there, along with 4 or 5 enslaved Africans. And these enslaved Africans, of course, had some form of a machete or something to chop down these trees. So it is presumed that they were treated better because of that. Again, even though those statements are there, to me, slavery is slavery. You can't
Yes.
really, you understand? As I
Yeah.
said, that is the basis that is being used to say that slavery in Belize was more humane to an extent.
You know, Delmer, I think it shouldn't be lost on us the significance of sugar in the slave trade at the time. Sugar was really considered gold. This product that the Europeans used to make their tea, for example, came at the cost of many African descendants, blood, sweat, and tears. Sugar, this product that we now use in Belize, that we now produce in Belize to boost our economy, slavery was really an economic development strategy. It was a trade per se, sugar for slaves.
No, I think you are right. Sugar was one of the big boosters in this whole process, actually. Before, in the Caribbean, before sugar, it was tobacco and indigo. They were producing that. But of course, it required sort of less labor. But once sugar became the dominant product, it was a labor-intensive process. Yeah. And that sort of began creating a higher demand for labor. Right. And obviously, as we had stated, through what the Tainos and the natives in the Americas were not being enslaved so systematically as the ones that were being brought in. You understand? And that is one of the reasons as to why you have this trade booming so much. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight quite importantly is the fact that from the onset, the people that were being captured were resisting. A lot of times when we talk about emancipation, a lot of people like to say, it only occurred in the chambers in England, and it was a legal process. And 1807 with the abolition of the slave trade, and 1834 with passing of the Emancipation Act, and then eventually the ending of apprenticeship by 1838. It was all a legal process. Yeah. Yes, it was. But there was an enormous pressure. There was an enormous show of resistance by the enslaved population. And they did this in 2 ways. One, where you had more rebellious activities that were violent. So they would rebel and take over, for example, a whole plantation or a whole camp. They would take over camps in Belize or British Honduras at that point. And actually there are various reports or various instances where the settlers of British Honduras are calling for support from the from the crown because the
Yeah.
enslaved population were rising up. And that's another thing that we need to highlight as well, that the population imbalance was a lot. In other words, the need for labor, it meant that they were importing or bringing in a lot more people than the white population in the settlement.
Yeah. They were
The second-
outnumbered.
Yeah.
Yes, they were outnumbered, exactly, and they feared for their lives, actually.
Yeah.
And when the enslaved, or the people that were, unfortunately enslaved, when they rose, they had a potential of actually, taking over the settlement. And that was one of the ways that they were resisting. But the second way that they were resisting were more subtle ways, not doing the work properly, faking that they do not understand instructions. That sort of things were also things that they were using to resist slavery. So to me, that is also a push towards emancipation, because obviously, if there is no show of resistance, if there is no show of revolt and so forth, that would mean that they are just complacent to the whole situation, and then what would push this whole agenda towards emancipation itself.
Yeah. And as you said, it was the abolishment of slavery officially started on August 1st, but it wasn't, from being a slave to being completely free. There was an actual period of transition. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, so by 1834, and one of the things that we need to highlight here is that who was being benefited as a result of the transition that was happening. One of the things that I always talk about is apprenticeship. The apprenticeship period is the last 4 years before emancipation.
Yeah.
Apprenticeship was something that was done to the benefit of the masters, to give them, initially it was 6 years, then it was lowered to 4, to give them more years of free labor. And it was masked under the idea that they needed to help the former enslaved transition into freedom. You understand? They needed to train them and tell them, you know what, this is how your work, your week of work is going to happen. This is how you're going to get more or less paid and so forth. But obviously, what that was doing is that it was benefiting primarily the masters, who directly after 1834 were treating the ex-enslaved almost like slaves. You understand? It was so blatant. You understand? And that's one of the things that we need to highlight as well, that when this process was happening, there was some resistance by the masters. In the Caribbean, there is something called as the West India interests. And the West India interests were something that was in the English Parliament, battling against emancipation and battling against the abolition.
During that time, did we, of emancipation, when it finally came about, did we see any sort of mass exodus? I'm wondering if Africans who had their roots there in Africa, if they decided, you know what, it's time for us to go back home, if they even in fact had the resources to do so, or whether they decided, well, this is our land now, this is our home, and this is where we'll settle. What does history
many
say
of
about
them,
that?
yeah, but one of the things that you need to note is that slaves were not paid, right? They were not paid. Some of them would have their little agricultural farmland on the side, but it was not like they were generating big money per se. You also had some free colors in the settlement. But when emancipation happened, the masters placed blocks so that they would, one, stay, two, they would return to their ex-masters to work. So as I had stated previously, land was something that within the masters, they would just be getting for free. They put a price during the period of abolition and emancipation. They put a price to land now to avoid having the ex-slaves take over land. They began to institute the Masters and Servants Act, which would be contracts that would be binding again the ex-enslaved with the ex-master. And a lot of abuses happened throughout that process, where the magistrates and even the police force was being used against the people. And then, of course, as I had stated, there were also cultural things such as the advance and truck system that would be tying these people or the ex-enslaved to the ex-masters. But as it relates to a mass exodus, I honestly, I cannot comment on that because I do not, from my recollection or my studies, I have not come across any record stating that there was a mass record of people or a mass exodus of people moving out of the colony.
Yeah. Delmar, let's bring it back to today for a moment, and let's just dive a bit into why, from your perspective, and I know it's a group of historians that, I mean, we've been talking about African and Maya history, I don't know for how long, and the fact that these aren't necessarily parts of our history lesson that we dive very deep into. Why is it that you feel that the conversation about slavery in Belize is not one that is as robust as what we see in other parts of the Caribbean?
Well, I think one of the things that I need to highlight is not only slavery. That's the whole problem to me. Okay. That history is something that, it's interesting. Some people talk about it, but within the formal educational system, there is no course such as saying Belizean history per se. And when I talk to formal, I'm talking high school, primary school. We get Belizean history until you go to a sixth form, and at that level, there's another level of understanding. And let's be real, the course is very intensive, and it's at another level. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that there is not much debate about history on a whole. It's not only about slavery, it's about history on a whole. But one of the things that we also need to understand is that we need to move away from the ideas of just simply glorifying the past and glorifying everything to a phase where we need to be critical about the history of our country. We need to be critical about the lessons that were there so that we can leave a better understanding of why things happen and the way things happen to our children. And I think that is where a culture needs to be created of questioning, a culture of being able to cope with the raw truth and being able to cope with different views of the past.
It's also
yes.
I'm sorry to interject there. I was just thinking, it's also a foundation to building identity. Yeah. When you really understand at your core where you come from and your connections. Yeah. Right. But you raise such an interesting point. So you don't feel that the social studies curriculum, and I think I had civics growing up too. Those were kind of the original, the elementary level Belizean history that we got. You don't feel that these dive deep enough into the history of our country?
I don't feel so. And the reason for it is because I believe that in almost every other country, there is a history base. And history is a story that tells everything else. In other words, I could tell you about civics, about climate change, about life in Belize, all through history. And that criticality is what is important to me, because it gives you an understanding of why we should learn all of this. And one of the things that you mentioned to me is very important, which is identity and rootedness, where what you're trying to do is to search for that root line of how is it that I belong to this nation. And that to me is something that is done through history, where you understand the formation of this modern state from its pre-colonial origins up to today. You understand there were activities that shaped the Belize that we have today.
Right, and that's not to interrupt, but you're going there, so I wanted to ask, based on your knowledge of history, the vast knowledge that you have, what are some of the remnants of slavery that we can identify in our culture and our society today?
Remnants, are you saying?
Yeah, the remnants of it, the things that we see now that perhaps were passed down to us from our history, slave history.
Okay, well, one of the things, and I'm going to mention one of the controversies actually, which was the Paslow building. Again, that is evidence that we are not aware of some of our own history. Thomas Paslow was a slave owner, one of the ruthless ones. And there was a resistance to naming the building the Paslow building again. And the reason for that was primarily because of these historical facts that are out there,
Yeah.
where a group of activists are basically saying, look, this is, yes, you have a building, but that's part of the remnants of slavery.
Yeah.
Do you really want to glorify that just for glorifying sake? And this is where I go to the ideas of heritage and cultural heritage, tangible heritage, where what is the purpose or why is it that we're glorifying certain things? Because I can, for example, give you or show you shackles. That could be a symbol of heritage. But should we glorify that? With what perspective are we showcasing that? That is where I think we need to come with more critical views, more questioning of those particular aspects of history. You understand? We should not, for example, as I stated, highlight Thomas Paslow as a savior. He was a slave owner. He was someone that was, one of the most ruthless in Belize.
And it took 35 years and on the brink of being renamed Paslow Building and a bit of protest to get to the point where the name change took place. I mean, admittedly,
Yes.
we're still a young country. And so we are learning as we go along as well. But I'm interested to know, Delmar, when you talk with students who perhaps this is their first introduction into understanding our own history, what's it like for them, that enlightenment that they get then?
Well, the reaction that I get is that they're very excited, actually.
Yeah.
And when you talk about history, when you talk about the past, there's a lot of excitement because they begin to think about, how was life back then. And one of the things that I try to emphasize a lot is imagination. So imagine if you were going through this. So there are a lot of encountered emotions for many of them. But when they realize what was happening and when they realize from a different perspective the story of Belize, it is empowering to many of them. And that is where, for me, I like to collect expressions from them through poems, through songs, through even speeches where they impersonate characters in history.
Nice.
And that particular process shows me that they are reflecting.
Yeah.
And that is very important to me.
Yeah.
Because when they reflect, that means that something is going and they're thinking about something is going on in their mind. And that process is what brings you towards rootedness and identity.
Yeah. Are you concerned that this now national commemoration of Emancipation Day, that the message behind it is going to be lost?
I am concerned, but I am also, as I started off with stating that I am looking at the list of events that are going to happen at the different municipalities and also the different organizations now collaborating. I am concerned, but I am also, to an extent, calm about it because I am looking at the different approaches that are being taken, and the different approaches showcase a strong bias towards educating people about why is it that this is important. And to me, that is soothing because it showcases that we are worried or we want to do it right because we are worried about the significance of it for people to understand what is meant with Emancipation Day. Yeah. But overall, as I had stated, I am very excited and happy that it has reached, that the topic of emancipation has reached the national stage and people are actually talking about this topic as an important topic for Belize's development.
It was originally Freedom Day, I think, and then they went back to Emancipation Day. How do you feel about that?
Well, for me, as I had stated, both days would have been fine to me.
Okay.
To me, the name is yes, it's important, but to me, freedom, emancipation, they're synonyms to me.
Yeah.
You know, Marlene and Delmer, when I think about the day, it's a day for celebrating freedom, but it's also a day of somberness, a day to reflect on our history and our past, and it's a day to consider what our future will look like. Delmer, speak to a bit of what progression do you think, what progress do you think we should make, what steps do you think we should make moving forward as a culture, as a people, considering the history that we've had with slavery?
Well, as you mentioned about the day of emancipation, it's a day of somberness. I personally get very emotional. I get very emotional with these topics in particular because of the reality that I always, or for the past 3-4 years, I participated in the libation that happens,
Yeah.
that the Sister Yaya Marin organizes. And it always touches me that when I look out to the Atlantic or to the Caribbean Sea,
Yeah.
you know, the significance of the things that happen there.
Yeah.
Like it's a source of hope for many, but yet when you look at it and you think about slavery, it touches you, and it's very emotional, because it tells you, you know, that there were many injustices happening in our past. But as I had stated, we need to reach for a moment of reconciliation, of stating with ourselves and basically reflecting on ourselves, to learn about why this is important. Learning, to me, and learning this process, learning its significance, is one of the most important steps that we need to take going forward as a people. Because that's the only way we're going to be generating consciousness, and are going to empower ourselves to make change for this nation.
I think that's such a great way to close off the conversation this morning. Delmer, we only scratched the surface this morning. I acknowledge that.
did.
But we didn't want the day to come around without having people at least know what we can reflect on when August 1st comes around, and what it means for us as a country that we are acknowledging this part of our history. Thank you so much, Delmer.
Thank you, Delmer.
Thank you as well.
Truly.
Well, I encourage everybody to participate in the celebrations.
Yeah.
I think there will be a lot online. You have
Yeah.
a lot of events online. If you can, well, I don't think we're allowed to join or have any big celebration, but
Yeah.
if you can join in any way, it's historic.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a 1-minute meditation on what happened, it's important for you to do that for Belize.
That's right. That's right. There are a number of activities. I know Niche has some of them posted on their site. We had Musa Shahid with us, and they're doing drums, not guns. The band is doing a Sambai celebration as well. So you can actually tune into that virtually. So we all have a way to be able to connect with the significance of the day. Thank you again, Delmer. Stay safe. All right. And with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we have double the fun, actually. Our junior co-hosts are going to be, they've been showcasing some of the activities that kids can get involved in over the summer. And so we have another Out and About with our junior co-hosts, AJ and Noelle.
This time around, they did some art, I understand. So
I'm sure they're much better at it than we are.
children and art, they love it. And so yes.
Then Jenny comes back with talking about mental stress. We do encourage you to send in your questions. She's going to be with us, and she'll be able to respond to any of the questions or concerns that you have when you're talking about dealing or coping with stress. That's coming up after the break, so stay tuned.